My name is Jack Thorne. For over 3 years, I've been running from the SCP Foundation. This is my story. Sam and I sat in the tiny waiting room and stared at the reflective metal wall opposite us. "How long is he going to make us wait?" Sam asked angrily, playing with an empty paper cup on the long metallic table. How should I know? I was feeling as angry as Sam, but I didn't want to show it. The truth was, I didn't know what was taking so long. Sam and I had traveled a long way to meet with a friend I'd known years ago, someone I met when I first escaped. He'd wanted to safely house me with other SCPs, but I was too stupid to listen. I thought I'd do better on my own, but lately I've encountered too many near-death experiences to feel safe. I finally want the helping hand it extended to me long ago. The door finally opened, and Jacob walked in wearing a dark blue suit and holding a clipboard. "You've got to be shitting me," I said. "When the cops made us wait here, I thought it was because you were volunteering here or something, bailing out some hooker. What are you now, some kind of detective?" Jacob smirked and he sat down. "I'm some kind of something." "Come on, Sam, let's go," I said with a huff as I stood up. "You're not going anywhere, Jack," he said quietly. "So why don't you sit back down?" "You son of a bitch," I replied. "I came to you because we need protection. The you-know-who is after us, and we keep getting attacked by certain types of people." "I'm well aware of your situation," Jacob sighed. "But a plane went down a week ago, and I've got a suspicion you were involved." "We don't have time for this," I said, looking down at Sam. "Let's..." My voice trailed off as I noticed Sam chuckling. "What's funny?" I asked. Sam didn't reply at first, just gave Jacob a wicked grin. I didn't like the look on her face. Sam really didn't like the police, so I had a strong feeling she had a premonition about something bad happening to Jacob. Sam leaned forward in her chair. "You're going to want to put ice on that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She then stood up. "Let's stand over here," she said hurriedly before pulling me into the far corner of the room. "I don't know what's going on here, but we have some questions for you, so if you wouldn't mind..." Jacob wasn't able to finish his sentence before another police officer burst into the room. "What is it, Fredrickson?" Jacob asked before the officer ran up to him, swinging his fists. Jacob blocked the first but was smashed in the jaw by the second. The officer then grabbed Jacob around his back and bit deeply into the top of his neck, pulling his head savagely to the side. A sickening crunch sounded from the bite, but Jacob didn't scream. His face frozen in shock. He was completely paralyzed as the officer feasted on the bone that now protruded from his neck. Sam wasted no time, running forward and fly-kicking the officer, sending him sprawling against the back wall. From outside the room, the sound of bullets and screaming filled the station. "Back where the Foundation kept me, they kept viruses alive in a lab," I said in disbelief. "Do you think..." "Yes, I do," Sam replied while pulling a gun out of the unconscious officer's holster. She then loaded the weapon and put it in her pocket. "Whoever wants us is very determined, and they're going to catch us sooner or later." Sam reached her hand out from the door, and a second later, a female officer's body collided with the wall to the left of where her hand was waiting. Sam then reached down and pulled the woman's hair tie out of her hair, using it to tie up her own. "If we're going to get ahead of these attacks, we're going to have to start acting more proactively. But first," I nodded in reply, "we need to get out of here." Sam stared intently at the clock on the wall, holding up a hand that signaled I shouldn't move. A minute passed when finally, an officer burst through the door and into Sam's waiting arms. She jumped onto the man's shoulders, then used his own weight to pull him onto the ground, smashing his head against the floor once he'd fallen. "Now!" she yelled. We then ran like hell out of the small room, snaking our way around cubicles, finally arriving at an office on the far wall and sneaking inside. Once inside the room, Sam closed the door, and I pulled the window shades. "Okay. I know I'm not supposed to ask, but how far ahead of time can you actually see?" Sam rolled her eyes. "It fluctuates, but basically only a few seconds." She then grabbed my left hand and held it against my eye. "What does it look like?" I shrugged. "Kinda looks like I'm looking through my hand." "Right, because your vision is separated and looking at two things at once. Imagine that, but you're looking at 2 points in time." "That seems like hell," I replied. A man suddenly burst into the room, who Sam casually tripped, then shot in the head. "It has its uses. Come on." She grabbed my hand, then we both crouched and ran through the screaming, fighting crowd until we reached the door to the station. Unfortunately, an enormous officer was blocking the exit. Sam fired her gun at the man, but he raised an anti-riot shield and blocked the bullets. He then threw the shield at Sam, knocking her to the ground. I ran at the man, throwing myself at him and knocking him through the glass police station door. From the ground, I held him by the neck and punched him in the face. He threw me off, sending me through the air and into a bus stop sign. He walked towards me, his hand outstretched, when a bullet from Sam sailed through the back of his head and out of his eye, sending a splatter of blood onto the pavement. He fell forward, dead. Sam helped me up. I actually know somewhere we can go that will amplify my power. If we go there, I can see further forward, and we can start finding these bastards before they even come looking for us. Sounds great, I replied. What do we need? Let's get some supplies from the supermarket across the street, then we'll grab a car and get the hell out of here, she said as we sprinted across the street. We took a shopping cart each, then agreed to grab all the food and supplies we would need for the next few days. I'm going to pay, I shouted over my shoulder as I took my car to the front counter. The checkout guy greeted me with a nod. His face was expressionless as he passed my items over the checkout machine. No! I heard Sam yell from behind me. I turned around just in time to see her slam into me, send me flying. I landed hard on the ground, something in my wrist snapping in the process. What the hell? I yelled out as I looked up to see Sam facing the checkout man. His arm was outstretched, holding a tranquilizer gun, the very gun that had shot a dart into Sam's chest. I felt the blood race to my head as I saw Sam stagger back, her face turning white. I lost all feeling in my body as I stood and ran towards the man. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I couldn't even perceive time. I barely remember what happened next. I remember holding the man's face in my hands, one hand holding the bottom of his jaw, the other hand holding the top. I remember crying. I remember the man lying on the ground, his jaw ripped off and embedded into the wall. But what I remember most was Sam ripping into the deli meat. She must have eaten 40 pounds of ham before collapsing onto the supermarket floor. I sat next to the deli fridge as Sam spent an hour cleaning it out, the deli worker long since having run away. I'm sure she had called the police, but everyone at the local station was either dead or had transformed into something else. Once I'd come to my senses, I bent down and slid my left arm under her knees and my right under her neck. I then picked her up and carried her outside. I walked through the car park until I found a convertible with the top down and then laid her on the back seat. I knew what I had to do, but it was terribly risky. Luckily, I had time. Having only been just injected, she would hibernate for some time before losing herself to the creature she was becoming. I knew that I had the time I needed to carry out my plan, but it would have to be executed flawlessly. Even one mistake and I would be captured or killed, and Sam would be lost, overtaken by the creature she was transforming into. I had to break into an SCP Foundation site and steal the antidote to the virus she'd been infected with. It was the only way to save her life. I sat in the driver's seat, pondering a way I could break into the facility. After an hour, I could hear the footsteps of the car's owner returning to the car. By this point, the police and FBI had already arrived and scoured the location. I hid by melting myself and Sam into the shadow cast by the convertible. Once the owner arrived, I relaxed as she drove us away from the scene, relieved that I put together a few pieces of what I would do next. While I hadn't enlisted Jacob's help those years ago, I remember who had, and better yet, I know where to find them. The woman arrived at a beautiful 2-story house and pulled the car into a spacious garage. She then switched off the car, grabbed her handbag, and walked inside. When she'd gone, the car sat in darkness for a few moments before I pulled myself and Sam out of the shadow and into the back of the car. "Don't worry, Sam, I'll save you," I whispered into her pale ear. "You'd better fucking believe I'll get you out of this."